You can't resist me forever. The alien queen swore she'd never love a human. Kale's boots scuffed against the battered metal floor as he strode into the flickering corridor, every step bringing him closer to the sealed interrogation chamber. The overhead lights, damaged in the recent skirmish, sputtered erratically, casting his hard features in shadows. In the center of the room behind reinforced glass, she stood perfectly still, her wrists bound by pulsing restraints of alien design. He paused on the threshold, letting the hum of the cell's dampeners vibrate in his bones. Her gaze was already on him, too focused, too calm for someone who'd just been hauled in as a prisoner. He inhaled, eyes narrowing in silent warning. Her metallic blue skin reflected faint lines of bioluminescence that pulsed like some steady heartbeat beneath its surface. She was exquisitely alien, every inch of her designed for superiority, from the regal slope of her shoulders to the chilling certainty in her stare. The air felt heavier, and Kale couldn't decide if it was the failing circulation systems or the tangible aura of her presence. Then she spoke, her voice like a blade sliding against steel. Is the intimidation supposed to start now, human? I expected more than a silent watchman. For a single heartbeat, Kale didn't reply. He simply let his lips curl into the ghost of a smirk. I don't tremble, he said eventually. Especially not for you. She angled her head, chains clinking as she tested their strength. Her voice was almost amused. Bold words, but I've tasted the fear of far greater men. You will break. They always do. A flicker of anger flashed in Kale's eyes, but he kept it leashed. He stepped in front of the glass and keyed a sequence on the console, lowering the barrier. The hiss of depressurization told him the chamber was cycling its atmosphere, so she'd have no advantage if her physiology thrived in different air conditions. His prior experiences had taught him that the Empire's queens could twist entire ecosystems to their benefit. You're going to tell me where your main fleet is gathering, Kale said, voice low. And you'll save everyone the trouble if you speak quickly. She didn't so much as blink. You already know I will say nothing. He approached closer, ignoring the cautioning beep of the console that signaled the potential risk of being too close to an alien queen, especially one with her rumored capabilities. The restraints were state-of-the-art. He told himself that. He told himself she was contained. She held her head high, white silver hair cascading around her face in a way that made the stark cell feel less like a prison and more like a stage for her command. You'll change your mind, he murmured. Everyone does, eventually. No one withstands interrogation forever. She laughed, and the resonance sent a disturbing tingle through him. You've read about me, I'm sure. You must know how many times my enemies have claimed the same. He clenched his jaw. Memories of entire colonies gone silent under her empire's iron-fisted rule stabbed through him, but he wore his anger like armor. We'll see how long you last when you're out of options. Before he could say more, an alarm rang out through the corridors. Harsh red lights bathed the chamber in pulses. Kale whipped around to the display panels lining the wall. Enemy ships? A boarding party? This star outpost was supposed to be secure. I'd suggest you don't waste time on me, she said, voice soft yet unwavering. It sounds like your fortress is crumbling. Her mocking tone only fueled Kale's tension, but he forced himself to remain calm. He keyed in a command to re-establish the energy field, wanting to keep her contained. The console buzzed an error message. Systems were failing one by one. Damn it, he growled. He took 2 purposeful strides toward her, seized her by the arm as the restraints jangled. The discharge of a failing generator sizzled across the floor. You're not going anywhere. Her violet eyes gleamed with a dark amusement. I have no intention of fleeing from a facility under attack if it means my captors will soon be scurrying around in chaos. You humans do make everything so complicated. Kale tightened his grip, but she didn't flinch. She simply matched his stare. The tension between them crackled with more than just hostility. It was the friction of 2 formidable forces colliding. Even through the thick material of his glove, he felt the unusual warmth of her skin. It made him want to recoil, but he refused to back down. Static crackled over the comm panel at his waist. A frantic voice spat out partial words. Kale, breach, fourth, need backup. Then it cut out. He cursed under his breath. If the station was under assault, standard procedure would be to either terminate or move high-value prisoners. But with half the systems failing and an unknown number of hostiles aboard, he realized he had no time for standard procedure. He shoved her toward the exit, ignoring the sudden spike of adrenaline in his veins. She resisted only slightly, more out of principle than real effort. Her chains clanked, and she managed to turn her face enough to smirk at him, that smug confidence never wavering. Rough hands, soldier. Where's your chivalry? You'll be safer with me than locked in a cell if the station is overrun, he said, jaw set. Oh, so this is your rescue attempt, she teased, voice dripping with sarcasm. I feel so cherished. The corridor outside the chamber was thick with the smell of scorched metal. Sparks rained from overhead conduits, and emergency klaxons blared. Kale pushed her ahead, scanning the route for signs of enemy incursion. Usually, he'd preferred to keep a prisoner behind him where he could see them, but she was no ordinary captive, and letting her at his back was out of the question. They stepped over the body of a fallen guard, his armor blackened from an energy blast. Kale forced himself to remain focused. There was no time to mourn. He led them toward the docking bay, only to find the blast doors sealed and the control panel charred beyond recognition. Open it, he demanded, pressing the muzzle of his sidearm lightly against her bound hands, letting her see that refusing wasn't an option. She glanced back at him, one slender eyebrow raised. She slid her fingers across the battered console, her bioluminescent patterns flickering in rhythm with her breath. The circuitry is fried. Even I can't magically resurrect technology that's been obliterated. But, she trailed off, face turning pensive as she examined a side panel. If I divert power from your foolish security system, I might be able to do something. He loomed behind her, tension radiating off him. Just do it. A hiss of annoyance escaped her, but she complied. As she worked, Kale caught himself looking at the curve of her profile, the way her alien skin radiated light in fluid waves. He refocused instantly, silently berating himself for any slip in concentration. She was the enemy, royalty in an empire that had crushed countless human colonies. With a spark and a pop, the blast doors locked disengaged. She took a step back, letting him see her handiwork. He exhaled in relief but kept his guard up. Move, he said, gesturing with his weapon. They made their way inside. The docking bay was a scene of destruction. Half the bay doors were warped open, exposing a panoramic view of black space and a cluster of smaller attack craft. It looked like an entire pirate or mercenary raiding party, presumably allied with no one but themselves, was methodically stripping the station. Bodies littered the floor, both human and alien. He ducked behind a stack of crates, dragging her with him to avoid the scanning beams of an approaching group of intruders. The tension of forced proximity hit him like a wave. She stood so close that he could feel the heat radiating from her. A small trickle of something less tangible slid through his senses, some primal awareness of her presence, her voice, her everything. He forced it aside. She whispered, "They don't appear to be members of my empire. Are they your allies?" "Hardly," he breathed. "They're opportunists. And they'll kill us both if we're in their way." Her gaze flicked to his sidearm, then to the row of heavy artillery lying abandoned along the far wall. "Then perhaps we should put an end to them first." He studied the route. It was a risk. They were outnumbered, and she was still chained, though the restraints didn't seem to slow her confidence. "I'll handle them. You stay out of my line of fire." She let out a short laugh, as if she couldn't quite believe he tried to keep her out of the fight. "I am no damsel to be coddled. Unchain me, and we'll see how quickly they fall." He shook his head, refusing to comply. He wasn't ready to face the possibility of her turning on him at the worst moment. But even as he crouched there, analyzing the positions of the intruders, something in him hesitated. She was dangerous enough without her powers fully unleashed. Did he really want her at her full strength? Yet the alternative might be worse, Attempting to protect someone as lethal as she was while she remained half restrained would inevitably complicate his own survival. A burst of gunfire rattled the crates. He slid an arm around her waist on reflex to pull her down out of the line of fire, ignoring the jolt of awareness that flared across his senses at the contact. She bristled but didn't resist as bullets or energy blasts peppered the containers overhead. One of the intruders was approaching. Cale leaped up, fired 2 rounds into the man's chest, sending him sprawling with a ragged scream. Another intruder rushed in from the left, brandishing a plasma blade. Cale twisted, deflecting the strike with his forearm guard, and drove his fist into the attacker's jaw. The intruder crumpled, leaving Cale's knuckles throbbing. Zyra observed with a predatory gleam in her eyes. "So you're not all talk," she murmured. He didn't answer, spinning just in time to shoot a third pirate trying to flank them. That one collapsed to the ground, clutching a smoking wound. A hiss of energy overhead signaled a still-active turret. Cale cursed. This docking bay was a death trap. She touched his shoulder lightly with her bound hands. "We won't last long pinned here. Let me help." His instincts screamed no, but logic warred with caution. The more time they spent pinned down, the slimmer their chances of escaping the station altogether. "If you so much as breathe wrong," he began. Her lips curled. "Your threats are tiresome. Free me, or we both die here." With a grimace, he keyed the override code on her restraints. The device beeped, and the shimmering cuffs clicked open, dropping to the floor. Her hands came free, and Cale tensed, ready for a betrayal. Instead, she turned, eyes glinting with an almost savage excitement, and thrust her open palms toward the turret. A surge of alien energy rippled through the air, shorting out the turret's automated sensor, sending sparks in all directions. It was an impressive display, controlled, precise, terrifying. He realized the stories of her power hadn't been exaggerations. She pivoted in one smooth motion, unleashing another ripple of kinetic force that slammed into the next wave of intruders, knocking them off their feet. Cale stepped out to finish them with clean shots. Their synergy was strangely perfect. She disabled them with her abilities. He delivered the lethal follow-up. His blood pounded with the adrenaline of the fight, but an undercurrent of something else spiked each time her voice rang in his ears. He could sense her presence in a disturbingly palpable way, as though her very being called to him at a primal level. But there was no time to dwell on it. With the docking bay mostly cleared, Cale sprinted to a console by the primary hangar door. The system flickered with minimal power. She followed, her breathing only slightly elevated, which gave him a glimpse of how formidable her species truly was. He swore at the screen. "The station's main reactor is critically damaged. We have minutes before it overloads." "Then you'd better find a vessel," she said coolly. "Unless you plan to die here with me, which, while dramatic, seems unwise." He glared, ignoring the heat that pulsed just beneath his skin at the closeness of her voice. He pointed to a battered assault shuttle at the far side of the bay. "That ship might still be operational. We'll need to bypass its access codes." She arched a brow. "And that's where you want my help again, is it? You realize I could simply fly away and leave you behind." He stared her down. "If you do that, you'll die alone in the vacuum of space once the station's reactor blasted to shreds. We're stuck together, at least for now." She said nothing, but the quirk of her lips suggested she found amusement in the predicament. Without further argument, she glided over to the damaged shuttle's hatch. Cale followed close behind, scanning for more intruders. The docking bay was eerily silent now, except for the occasional spark and the wail of distant alarms. She placed her palm against the shuttle's hull, closed her eyes, and Cale watched as her bioluminescent patterns flared, brightening in waves that pulsed through her fingertips. It reminded him of some living circuit completing. Within moments, the hatch hissed open. He entered first, weapon raised, checking corners. The interior was dim, and the smell of ozone clung to the air. Panels flickered with partial power, and it was obvious the craft had been battered in the chaos. She slipped in behind him, eyes scanning the control console. "It needs a jump from the station's backup generator," she said, her voice laced with frustration. We'll have to reroute. An explosion rocked the docking bay, sending them stumbling. Cale grabbed a support beam to steady himself, saw that part of the ceiling had collapsed near the entrance. He coughed through the smoke. Another series of blasts vibrated through the structure. Something was happening to the reactor. Perhaps the meltdown was accelerating. Then move faster, he barked, fear and adrenaline sharpening his tone. She pressed her palm against a maintenance panel, and her eyes fluttered shut again, as if she were merging her consciousness with the craft's systems. Cale kept watch, tension coiled tight in every muscle. She was intangible, one moment seemingly passive, the next lethal. The line between ally and adversary was blurred, which gnawed at him. But for the time being, their survival hinged on collaboration. Done, she said, snapping her eyes open. There should be enough power for a short flight, but we must evacuate immediately. He slid into the pilot's seat, then hesitated. She placed a hand on his shoulder, an unexpectedly strong grip that sent a spike of awareness through him again. He tried to ignore it, punching the ignition sequence. Engines sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. The shuttle trembled under the strain of battered hull plating. He guided them off the decking, a wave of relief flooding him as the craft rose. Through the viewports, the station's flickering lights painted a desperate scene. Cracks lined the walls, and entire corridors had collapsed. Cale exhaled through gritted teeth, maneuvering around debris. You might want to hold on, he muttered, his voice thick with tension. She braced herself against the console, showing no fear, only intense focus. He accelerated, the battered shuttle slipping through the shimmering barrier of the docking bay. Once clear, the vastness of space greeted them, stars glinted, and the silhouettes of the attacking ships were partially visible around the station. She pointed. There. A gap in their formation. If you can steer us behind that chunk of twisted plating, we might avoid their scanners. He nodded, setting course. The shuttle rattled ominously, but it kept pace, slipping through a hole in the blockade. Fire erupted from the station behind them, a chain reaction that signaled the meltdown had truly begun. The shockwave rippled outward, and Cale shoved the throttle to maximum. The craft lurched violently, but they pulled away just in time. A massive explosion consumed half the raiders lingering near the outpost, the bright flare swallowing them whole. Debris pinged off the shuttle's hull. He hissed as an alarm started blaring, indicating hull stress. She moved closer, ignoring the alarm. There's a warp gate nearby, or so your systems say. If we can reach it, we'll be harder to track. He glanced at her. You really think I'm going to bring you into human territory? Her answering smile was razor-sharp. I think you have no choice. We both know I can sense your route through this craft's navigation. You need me if you want to survive the next few hours. We're far from done. He let out a rough laugh, humorless. Then do what you do best, find weaknesses in the Empire, or in me, or in the gate's security. I don't care, as long as we get through alive. She lifted her chin, studying him for a long moment. You speak of me as though I'm just another weapon at your disposal. But you forget I'm the one who can crush your mind if I choose to. His pulse pounded. He locked eyes with her. Try it. See what happens. She held his gaze, and for a tense second, the cabin filled with the hum of their clashing wills. Then she broke eye contact with a dismissive snort. He resisted the urge to grin, though part of him savored that she hadn't followed through. He plotted a course to the nearest warp gate on the battered console. The star map flickered, showing them an established route. As he guided the shuttle forward, he tried not to think about how close she stood behind him, her presence an almost tangible force pressing against his senses. They navigated the field of broken station fragments, drifting whole shards from the destroyed raider ships, and the swirling cosmic debris. Every minor impact made the shuttle's structure groan. The tension in the cockpit was like a coiled serpent, ready to strike. Halfway to the warp gate, another alarm blared, indicating the engines were overheating. Cale slammed a fist against the console in frustration. If the engine fails now, we'll be stranded. She studied the readout. We're losing coolant. The system can't self-repair. We'll have to do it manually or we won't make it. He wanted to curse again but settled for a terse nod. Fine. The coolant regulator's in the back. I'll keep us stable. She swept past him, and he felt a jolt of her presence again, that quiet confidence she carried like a mantle. He refocused on the pilot controls, but he couldn't banish her from his thoughts entirely. She was in his craft, in his space, and she was far too calm for someone who'd almost died with him minutes ago. Moments later, her voice echoed from the rear compartment. I've found the leak. Hand me that kit from under the console. He got up, quickly set the autopilot, and joined her. She'd already torn away a panel, revealing the coolant system. The hiss of escaping vapor formed a fog around them. Careful, he snapped, grabbing the kit. That gas can be toxic. She shot him a glare. Your technology is so primitive. Stand aside. He almost barked a retort but forced himself to let her work. She used a tool from the kit to seal the leak. Although the process should have been complicated, she moved with uncanny deftness, as if understanding the craft's systems instinctively. Despite his best efforts, Kale's eyes drifted over her alien features. The arcs of bioluminescence pulsing under her skin, the shape of her arms tensed in concentration. He told himself it was just a passing observation, forced proximity, nothing more. But his awareness was piqued in a way he couldn't deny. He turned away abruptly, focusing on the swirl of coolant fog dissipating around them. Done, she said, stepping back. He tested the system from a side console, relief washing through him as the temperature readings stabilized. But the moment he exhaled, his body reminded him how drained he was. Adrenaline only carried him so far. She must have felt it too, though she hid it well. They returned to the cockpit, where he resumed manual control. The warp gate glowed ahead, a ring of shimmering energy that promised safety, or a new set of dangers, depending on what awaited them on the other side. He looked at her. Once we're through, I need to contact my commanding officer. We can't just wander the galaxy with you at my side. Her laugh was low. You think I'm eager to remain with you any longer than necessary? Once I secure my freedom, I'll have no use for your people. Or perhaps I'll turn your own superiors against you. His jaw tightened. Try it and see. She leaned against the co-pilot's seat, crossing her arms in a motion that drew his attention to the faint luminescence tracing her collarbones. He averted his eyes, gripping the controls. You trust your officers, she said. How quaint. I've learned that loyalty is a malleable concept. He gave her a withering glance. You'd know, wouldn't you? The entire empire runs on fear and forced oaths. Her lips curled into a half-smile. And how is that different from your interrogation cells, your intimidation? Humans and my kind are more alike than you think. Except you started the war, he muttered. You conquered dozens of human outposts. Her expression darkened, but she didn't deny it. Your people expanded into our territory first. We merely enforced boundaries. He snorted. Boundaries enforced by planetary bombardment. That's your justification? Her silence spoke volumes. Then, with a dismissive tilt of her chin, she looked away. The warp gate dominated the view, swirling with cosmic energy. Kale engaged the approach protocol, heart pounding. If they were unlucky, there'd be a blockade waiting on the other side. But either way, there was no turning back now. He fired the thrusters, pushing them through. The shuttle shook violently, then everything outside became a kaleidoscope of shifting lights. It lasted only a few seconds before they emerged in a different sector of space. The starlight changed hue, and a small planet loomed in the distance, a rocky sphere dotted with swirling clouds. Kale exhaled. We made it. She tapped a control, scanning for local signals. I detect faint transmissions from that planet. Possibly a small outpost? His brow furrowed. I wasn't aware we had a station in this system. Could be a fringe mining colony. She shrugged, stepping aside. Then let's see if your people are friendly enough to let us land. Unless you plan to drift out here until your vessel disintegrates. He tried to raise the local frequency, but all he got was static. No response. Maybe it's abandoned. Her posture stiffened, the lines of her shoulders tense. Then it's our only option. The ship won't hold up for much longer in open space. He grimaced, changing course toward the planet. The atmospheric readouts were borderline habitable. If the shuttle held together during re-entry, they'd at least have an environment that wouldn't kill them instantly. As they descended, the hull rattled ominously. The friction of entry turned the front windows orange red. Cale clenched his teeth, fighting the controls as the battered ship bucked. She braced herself, one hand splayed on the console, the other gripping the seat. He could sense her tension even without looking. Smoke began pouring from an aft panel. Warning sirens blared. Cale suppressed a shout of frustration, focusing on the approach. Through the swirling flames of re-entry, he glimpsed the rugged terrain, jagged mountain ridges and canyons carved into the planet's surface. A few shaky pulses of the control thrusters slowed them enough to avoid a catastrophic crash. They slammed down in a rough clearing, the landing gear collapsing on impact. A savage scrape of metal tore through the air, and Cale felt the world flip. Everything spun, a deafening roar of twisted steel and fracturing hull plates. His vision blurred. When the chaos finally subsided, he found himself lying against the cockpit bulkhead, head pounding. Smoke filled the cabin. The front of the shuttle was canted at an angle, windows cracked. He spat out blood, pulled himself up. She was pinned beneath a toppled compartment door, hair tangled around her face. Yet her eyes were open, furious, alive. He rushed over, heart hammering, tugging the debris off. She winced in pain, but she steadied herself quickly. "If this is your idea of a smooth landing," she said through gritted teeth, "I'd hate to see a rough one." He snorted, relieved she was conscious. Then, with a heave, he helped her to her feet. A cut on her temple leaked faint, shimmering blood, some alien hue that made him pause for a fraction of a second. "You're bleeding," he said, ignoring how strange it was to offer concern. She pressed a hand to the wound, pulling away with a dark smear on her fingertips. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll live. Let's focus on getting out of this wreck before it explodes." They forced the damaged side hatch open, stepping onto dusty, rocky ground. The air was hot, thin, but breathable. The shuttle's hull was half buried in a shallow trench of its own making. Smoke billowed from the engine compartment. Cale grabbed an emergency kit from inside the door, ignoring how his own body screamed with bruises. A few moments later, the shuttle's core hissed, and a small eruption of flame blasted from the vents. They stumbled back, shielding their faces. The craft was gone, no chance of repair. She let out a slow breath, scanning the horizon. The alien sun was low in the sky, painting the rocky landscape in rust-colored light. "Wonderful," she muttered, sarcasm lacing her tone. "Better than dead in space," he replied, squinting into the distance. "Let's see if we can find that outpost." She nodded, pulling her hair out of her face, revealing the faint glow of her temple wound. "If it exists at all." They began to walk. For a few minutes neither spoke. The tension still simmered, but exhaustion was creeping in, a shared vulnerability that neither wanted to acknowledge. The dry wind kicked up dust devils around them. Cale led, scanning the horizon for any sign of structures. Eventually, they crested a ridge that overlooked a wide plateau. In the far distance, columns of smoke rose from what looked like a settlement. Cale felt a flash of hope. "That could be it." She exhaled, her breath ragged. "Then let's go. I'd rather not collapse out here." They descended the jagged path, carefully navigating loose stones and sudden drops. Once, she slipped, and Cale instinctively grabbed her arm. The moment of contact sent an unwanted surge of awareness through him. He couldn't ignore the tension in his chest, or how her skin felt against his palm. She pulled free quickly. "I'm fine," she snapped, as if the idea of leaning on him for support was abhorrent. He nodded, swallowing back a retort. They continued in tense silence. The wind grew stronger, whipping her silver hair around her face, and though he tried not to stare, he found himself momentarily transfixed by the way she moved with that same unbreakable confidence despite the battered condition they were both in. Hours seemed to pass before they finally neared the outskirts of the settlement they'd spotted. It was a series of low structures made of metal scavenged from who knew what, forming a crude makeshift base. There were signs of a recent battle, scorch marks, wreckage, twisted scraps of advanced machinery. Kale motioned for her to keep low as they approached. She rolled her eyes but complied. The place seemed deserted, or at least there was no immediate activity. They crept along the half-collapsed wall. Kale peered around the edge into a courtyard. A handful of bodies lay scattered across the ground, humanoid, but not all human. Some were from various species that roamed the outer systems. The stench of decay mingled with burned ozone. He eased forward, weapon drawn, scanning for threats. She stayed right behind him, her breath hot on his neck. The entire settlement looked ransacked. If there'd been survivors, they were gone by now, or in hiding. He found a building that looked partially intact, with working doors. Inside, the lights flickered dimly, powered by an unstable generator. There were scattered crates of supplies, some basic medical kits, half-charged energy rifles. She immediately spotted a terminal in the corner, crossing the room to inspect it. This might tell us what happened here. Or at least show us if there's a functional ship hidden away. While she fiddled with the terminal, Kale rifled through the crates. He found some rations, presumably local produce sealed in vacuum packs, and a container of water. He tossed one to her. She caught it without looking up, only after a split second of hesitation. They both drank, either acknowledging the absurdity of sharing resources. Finally, she made a frustrated noise at the terminal. It's locked behind some encryption. I can brute force it, but it'll take time. He glanced around the room. Time was not something they had in abundance, given the unknown threats in the area. But what choice did they have? All right, he said begrudgingly. I'll keep watch outside. You do whatever you need to do. She nodded, turning back to the screen. He headed for the doorway, pausing to look at her from behind. The light cast across her features highlighted the faint shimmer of her bloody temple, the lines of concentration on her face. He reminded himself she was the reason for so much death and destruction. The moment he let his guard down, she could kill him, or worse. With a silent grimace, he stepped out into the deserted courtyard. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the blood-stained ground. He checked the perimeter, scanning for anything that might move or threaten. A swirl of conflicting emotions gnawed at him, the hate he'd nursed against her empire, the grudging respect for her resilience, the disquieting awareness of her presence that refused to leave him. He forced himself to focus on practical matters, like ensuring they weren't ambushed while she hacked the terminal. Time dragged. The wind picked up, carrying the acrid smell of scorched metal from elsewhere in the settlement. Kale's eyes were gritty with fatigue, but he refused to rest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she emerged. Did you get what you needed? He asked. She looked a bit triumphant. I accessed the logs. Some mercenary group attacked this outpost a few days ago. The survivors either fled or were taken. But I found a reference to a hidden hangar beneath the main structure, containing a functional ship. We can use it to get off this rock. He pressed his lips into a thin line. Any mention of booby traps or defenses? Likely. I saw references to a security system, possibly automated turrets. But we're out of options. He nodded. Fine. Lead the way. She arched a brow. You're letting me lead? He met her gaze. You know the route. Don't get any ideas. She merely smirked, turning back inside. He followed her down a corridor, past a collapsed beam, and into what looked like a storage area. At the far end stood a reinforced door, locked and sealed. She gestured to a control panel. That should open it. Or at least I can try. He covered her while she tried to bypass the lock. The door hissed in protest, then slid open, revealing a dark stairwell descending into the sublevels. A foul odor wafted out. They descended carefully, flashlights cutting through stale air. The steps led to a wide underground hangar. Debris littered the floor, and the overhead lights flickered weakly, revealing a mid-sized ship in the center, a sleek craft that looked mostly intact. Cale's pulse quickened. This could be their salvation. They approached, scanning for any sign of movement. The massive hull of the vessel glimmered in the low light, a design that appeared far more advanced than a typical human or alien fighter. Possibly some stolen prototype. He let her move to the access hatch, prepared for trouble. She paused, gazing at the control panel. This is extremely high-level tech. If I manage to open it, the onboard AI might still have caretaker protocols. It could be hostile. We'll deal with it, he said grimly. Do it. She placed both hands on the panel, and her bioluminescent patterns flared brighter than before. Cale stepped back, feeling that strange surge of tension again, like her power and presence reached out to fill the space. Sparks danced around her fingertips. With a groan of metal on metal, the hatch unlocked. A moment later, the door slid open. A hiss of pressurized air escaped the vessel. She glanced back at him, a trace of satisfaction in her eyes. After you, dear interrogator. He scoffed but climbed in first, scanning the interior with his flashlight. The corridors were cramped but well designed. He checked for any immediate threats. The main power was offline, though emergency lights glowed faintly. She joined him, stepping over cables. We need to find the cockpit. If we can power this ship, we might be able to take off. They moved through the vessel, discovering living quarters, a small cargo hold, and finally the cockpit. Cale slid into the pilot's chair, while she investigated the console behind him. The screens were dark, but there was a faint hum of standby systems. She reached out and placed her palm on a large circular interface, eyes fluttering shut again. Cale couldn't help but watch, the lines of her neck arching as she channeled her energy. A spark ran over her skin. The console lit up, flickering to life. An automated voice crackled. System rebooting. Unauthorized access recognized. Identify. Her eyes snapped open. Looks like the AI is still functional. I'll try to override it. She furrowed her brow, concentrating. Cale noticed sweat beading on her temple near the dried shimmer of her blood. She muttered alien syllables under her breath, some sort of code or command sequence. The console flickered, then stabilized. Override accepted. The AI droned. Welcome, new user. Cale exhaled in relief as the screens glowed with navigational data. Nice work. She pulled her hand back. I've set it to minimal defenses, so it shouldn't fry us. The engine readouts show we can take off once we fuel up. There should be reserves in the hangar. They left the cockpit, heading for the hangar storage area. Several massive canisters lined the walls. Cale found a control mechanism to pump the fuel directly into the ship's intake. It was a slow process, the pumps rattling in protest, but it worked. While they waited, she paced near the vessel's ramp, looking uneasy for the first time since they'd met. He leaned against the crate, arms folded. What's the matter? She stopped, turning to him with a guarded expression. You wouldn't understand. Try me, he said, surprising himself. She studied him for a moment, the alien light in her eyes flickering. My empire is in disarray. If I don't return, another queen will assume the throne, or the empire might fracture into chaos. He frowned, reminded of just who she was. And that bothers you because you want to keep your people under your rule? She didn't smile. They are my people, yes. But you humans assume we're all monsters. You've seen the wars, the destruction, but not the reasons behind them. Let's just say I have an obligation to keep my empire from turning on itself. If that happens, it won't be just my species suffering. He tried to process her words, the undercurrents of her meaning. He didn't trust her. She was cunning, lethal. Yet there was a ring of truth to the concern on her face. The pump clanged, signaling the fuel transfer was complete. An uneasy silence settled as they walked back into the ship. She keyed a console, verifying the engine's new levels. The AI confirmed that the craft was ready for ignition. He watched her from behind, wrestling with conflicting urges. His training told him to keep her subdued until a human fleet could retrieve her. But she had proven herself vital, and part of him grudgingly respected her capability. More than that, something crackled in the air between them, some intangible thread. Finally, she met his gaze. "We should depart. This planet offers us nothing but ghosts." He nodded. "Let's see what this ship can do." She slipped into the co-pilot's station, while he took the pilot's seat. The engines hummed to life, vibrations coursing through the floor. With her guidance, the ship lifted smoothly, rising out of the subterranean hangar. A massive sliding door overhead responded to the vessel's systems, parting to reveal the desert sky. Seconds later, they soared upward, leaving the settlement behind. The planetary atmosphere thinned until they broke free into space. Cale exhaled, tension loosening from his shoulders. For now, they had a functioning ship, but their next step was unclear. He glanced at her, trying to read the set of her features. "We need a safe harbor to repair and resupply. Then we figure out what to do about you." She gave him a sidelong look. "I'm sure my captivity is at the forefront of your concerns." He felt a spark of annoyance. "You're not free to roam the galaxy. You destroyed countless lives. You realize I can't just let you walk away." She rolled her eyes. "Your sense of justice is admirable, if naive. But I suppose we'll see how strong that justice remains if I'm the only one who can help you survive." They fell silent again, the hum of the ship's systems filling the cockpit. Through the viewport, stars stretched out, beckoning them toward whichever path they chose. Cale began scanning for transmissions, hoping to find some safe port. The readings were sparse. After a few minutes, the console beeped. A faint signal came through, a distress call from a nearby sector. Cale's first instinct was to ignore it. They had their own problems. But the desperation in the crackling message tugged at him. "Someone's in trouble," he said. She glanced at him. "Then let them be in trouble. You owe them nothing." He clenched his fists. "I owe it to my own conscience." She studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Fine. Let's see how willing your conscience is to put up with me interfering." He plotted the coordinates for the distress signal. The ship accelerated, the engines responding smoothly. The tension between them remained thick, and though they both appeared focused on the mission at hand, an undercurrent of restless energy simmered beneath the surface. Shortly after, the source of the distress came into view, a small civilian vessel, half drifting near an asteroid field. Panels were missing, and it looked like it had sustained heavy fire. Cale maneuvered closer, scanning for life signs. "Survivors 3, the ship's AI announced. "Vital signs deteriorating." She scoffed softly. "You plan to pick them up? They could be criminals, or diseased, or spies." Cale set his jaw. "I won't leave them to die." He initiated docking procedures. The vessel had a universal docking port. Carefully, he guided them in. A clang echoed as the two ships connected. She stood crossing her arms, as though amused by his altruism. "I'll go check it out," he said, unsealing the hatch that led to the other ship. She lifted her chin in challenge. "And you expect me to just wait here?" He bristled. "I expect you not to sabotage my ship or murder me in the back." Her violet eyes glinted. "Where's the fun in that?" Despite the acidic remark, she followed him. They moved into the damaged vessel, flashlights sweeping over the dark corridors. Wires dangled from the ceiling, and the smell of burning plastic lingered. In one corridor, they found two survivors huddled behind a makeshift barricade, barely conscious from blood loss. Cale dropped to a knee, checking their pulses. They were alive but in rough shape. She stood behind him, eyes narrowed, as if reevaluating the logic of his mercy. The third survivor was slumped against the console, barely breathing. Cale motioned for her to help, but she didn't move immediately. Eventually, though, she relented, kneeling awkwardly next to the wounded man. She placed a hand on his forehead, closed her eyes. A soft glow emanated from her palm, not as intense as when she used her powers offensively. Cale watched in astonishment as the man's ragged breathing stabilized. She removed her hand, standing abruptly as though embarrassed. "Temporary fix," she said flatly. "He still needs proper medical attention." Let's get them onto our ship. Kale nodded, carefully hoisting one of the survivors over his shoulder. She managed to lift the other two with surprising ease, one by one, her alien physiology granting her unusual strength. They carried the wounded back through the docking tunnel into their new ship's cargo hold. He found a small med bay, set them down, and started rummaging for supplies. She stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching him. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly, surprising him with the sudden seriousness in her tone. "Because someone has to," he answered, trying not to sound defensive. "Not everyone is out for themselves." She made a non-committal sound, her expression guarded. But when one of the injured moaned in pain, she moved over to apply the same healing touch as before, though it was clear it taxed her. He found a power injector with broad-spectrum fluids and used it on the unconscious survivors. Neither he nor she said much, but working side by side like this created a different kind of tension, less combative, more uncertain. As though they were caught between old allegiances and a new, fragile understanding. After stabilizing the trio as best they could, Kale backed away, leaning against the wall, his mind churning. She wiped her hands on a cloth, glancing over at him. "You're not the brute I assumed you were," she said at last. He snorted. "And you're not the merciless tyrant I assumed you were. Or maybe you still are, and I'm just seeing a different angle." She didn't respond immediately, as though deciding how honest to be. "I have no love for humanity, but these people did nothing to me. There's no reason to let them die." He nodded. "I can work with that." They headed back to the cockpit. Once more, the proximity felt too charged. Every brush of her arm against his, every flicker of the cabin lights, seemed to heighten his awareness. "Your friends here will need medical facilities," she said, gesturing to the sleeping forms in the med bay. "Where do we find that?" He scanned the NAV charts. "Closest official outpost is Station Helios 9, in the neutral zone. We might find medical services and a place to rest." She folded her arms. "Neutral zone. So neither my empire nor your confederation can openly operate there without scrutiny. That's the idea." She let out a slow breath, stepping past him to examine the console. He stiffened when her shoulder grazed his. She typed a series of commands. "I'm setting a course. Might as well see if these neutrals can help. I'm curious to meet them." He tried to refocus on the task, ignoring the leap in his pulse. She sat next to him, brushing her hair back, revealing that mesmerizing pattern on her neck. He tightened his grip on the controls. There was no escaping the reality that they were now a team, however temporary, thrown together by circumstance. The tension of their interactions felt like a taut wire ready to snap at any moment, but at the same time, some part of him was intrigued by the idea that it might never snap at all, instead transforming into something else. He accelerated the ship, heading for the hyperlane that would take them to Helios 9. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and for a time, neither spoke. Her presence was like gravity, pulling at him even when he tried to shut it out. "Once we arrive," he said finally, breaking the silence, "I'll see about transferring you into more secure custody." Her lips twitched. "Trying to be rid of me so soon? I thought we were getting along." He stared straight ahead, refusing to meet her eyes. "Don't push your luck." She smiled, a mysterious expression he caught from the corner of his vision. His heart beat faster despite himself. He told himself it was just the aftermath of survival, the adrenaline. It had to be. They slipped into hyperspeed, the streaks of light outside the viewport indicating their jump. The cabin lighting dimmed to a soft glow. He set the controls to autopilot. The journey would take several hours. He pressed a few keys, verifying the survivors' conditions in the med bay. Monitoring equipment indicated they were stable. She observed from over his shoulder, so close that he felt the warmth of her breath. He cleared his throat. "Why don't you rest? You lost blood." She scoffed. "I'm not fragile. Besides, I don't trust you not to steer this ship into your own military's clutches." He turned to face her, meeting her gaze. He was surprised by how close they were, their noses almost inches apart. The small space in the cockpit forced a confrontation neither seemed ready for. He could see the subtle patterns of color along her cheekbones, the faint shadow of exhaustion under her eyes. "I won't deny that part of me wants to hand you over," he said. "But right now, we have bigger concerns. Once these people are safe, we'll talk about your future." She held his stare, as if searching for cracks in his resolve. Something flickered in her gaze, annoyance, curiosity, maybe even attraction. He refused to be the one to look away. Finally, she stepped back. "I'll get something to eat. If you do anything foolish, I'll kill you before you even draw your weapon." He smirked. "Noted." She left the cockpit, and the sudden void of her presence made him exhale with relief. Alone, he tried to compartmentalize what he was feeling. This uneasy alliance was precarious. Even if there was a spark of mutual respect, or something more primal, between them, it could be extinguished the moment their objectives conflicted again. He closed his eyes, letting the hum of hyperspace lull him into a half-doze. Images danced in his mind, her face, the raw power in her eyes, the subtle curve of her lips when she challenged him. He forced those images away, reminding himself of the thousands of dead humans her empire left in its wake. There could be no forgiveness, no union. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind suggested that if they continued like this, fighting side by side, discovering surprising depths within each other, the lines might blur further. He shuddered at the thought. Time passed, marked only by the gentle beep of the instruments and the distant hum of the life support systems. The autopilot indicated they were on schedule, a few hours out from Helios 9. Eventually, she returned, carrying 2 ration bars. She tossed one to him. He caught it, eyeing it suspiciously. "You trust the supply in this ship?" he asked. She shrugged, biting into her own. "If it's poisoned, I'll meet my fate before you." He snorted, unwrapping the bar and taking a bite. It tasted bland, with a metallic aftertaste, but it was nourishment. They ate in silence. Once done, she sank into the co-pilot's seat, leaning back, eyes half-lidded. The tension in her features told him she was in pain, or at least severely drained. Yet her pride kept her from showing weakness openly. He sighed. "Look, you should rest. I'll keep watch." She didn't respond at first, but eventually her eyelids closed fully. Within moments, her breathing grew softer, though she still seemed coiled, as if ready to spring up if he made the wrong move. Cale stayed awake, mind spinning with half-formed thoughts. The memory of their close combat in the docking bay, how her powers had disabled the turret, how she'd saved him from a plasma blast he hadn't even seen coming. The moment he unchained her because survival demanded it. His body ached with bruises from the crash, but it was nothing compared to the internal struggle he faced whenever he looked at her. She was undeniably alluring in her alien majesty, yet every rational part of him insisted she was the enemy. He forced his gaze away from her sleeping form, focusing on the star-streaked viewport. The autopilot counted down the hours to their arrival at Helios 9. If the station accepted them, that might be the end of this tenuous partnership. He told himself that was for the best. But a small part of him wondered if, in that moment, it truly would be over. Eventually, the hyperspace jump concluded. The swirling lights outside dissipated, revealing the Helios 9 station in the distance, a massive ring structure rotating around a luminous star. Cale sat up straighter, toggling comm systems. She stirred beside him, opening her eyes. They both tensed, as if remembering who they were. He cleared his throat. "Helios 9 is in view." She nodded, standing to stretch. "Then let's see if they shoot us on sight or not." He tried the comm again. A grainy voice responded. "Unidentified vessel, state your business." "Rescue operation," Cale replied. "We have injured civilians aboard." There was a pause. "Very well, you are cleared to dock at Bay 12. Any breach of station protocol will be met with lethal force." "Understood?" Cale glanced at her. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Understood," he confirmed. The approach to Helios 9 was tense. The station's turrets tracked them, reminding them that neutrality here was enforced by overwhelming firepower. Kale guided the ship into the assigned bay, the docking clamps engaging with a metallic thud. He powered down the engines, turning to face her. "We'll get the wounded to the medical facility. After that, we figure out what to do about you." She gave him a slow, calculating smile. "My fate in your hands? How poetic." He ignored the unsettled feeling in his stomach. They gathered supplies, moved the wounded onto stretchers, and prepared to step onto the station. Kale paused at the ramp, looking back at her. "Don't do anything stupid," he warned. She rolled her eyes. "Likewise." They exited together, pushing the makeshift stretchers. Station personnel hurried over, doctors, guards with weapons drawn, scanning them. One guard stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Zyra. "State your identity," the guard ordered, the muzzle of his rifle aimed at her. She stood tall. "I am Zyra. That is all you need to know." Kale intervened before the guard pushed further. "She's with me. We're providing medical evac for these people." The guard studied him suspiciously. "And who are you to be traveling with? Her?" "Name's Kale. We were stranded. She helped me rescue these survivors." The guard's eyebrows rose at the mention of her help, but he motioned for the medical crew to take the wounded. They whisked them away on hovering gurneys. The guard turned back to Kale. "Station Helios 9 remains neutral in all conflicts. If your companion here causes trouble, we'll space you both. Understood?" Kale nodded. "Understood." The guard stepped aside. They were left in the hustle of the docking bay, with mechanics moving to examine their newly acquired ship. Kale felt the weight of stares from various onlookers, curious about the striking alien queen at his side. She met those stares with cool indifference, her posture radiating imperial confidence. Kale wondered if she realized how dangerous that regal bearing could be in a place where hidden enemies might roam. Or maybe she just didn't care. They made their way through the station's corridors until they found the small medical wing. Through the observation window, they could see the wounded survivors receiving treatment. Kale felt a small sense of relief. At least they would survive. When he looked at Zyra, her expression was unreadable. "You want to check on them?" he asked. She blinked once, as if surprised by the question. "I have no interest in your people's well-being. I did what was necessary to help you complete your self-appointed mission of mercy." He shrugged. "Right." They turned away, walking deeper into the station. The corridors were cramped and full of travelers from many species: humans, reptilian traders, insected pilgrims. Some gave them wide berths, especially upon seeing Zyra's luminous skin. She strode through them as if she owned the place. Near a cluster of merchant stalls, Kale pulled her aside, lowering his voice. "We need a plan. If you think I'm letting you vanish into the crowds..." She shot him an icy glare. "You try to stop me?" He stood firm. "Yes. I still have a duty to bring you to justice for everything your empire has done." Her eyes blazed. "My empire is more complicated than you can comprehend. But fine, let's pretend your duty matters. You're willing to throw away this tenuous trust we've built?" He scoffed. "Tenuous is right. You haven't exactly proven yourself innocent." She opened her mouth to retort, but a sudden commotion drew their attention. A group of station security officers rushed by, carrying weapons. Alarms blared overhead. Kale and Zyra exchanged glances. "This might be our chance to slip away," she suggested. He grabbed her arm. "Or it could be trouble heading our way." She tensed at his touch, but didn't break free. "Let's find out." They followed the officers at a distance, weaving through panicked crowds. The alarms grew louder, and a station-wide announcement crackled. "All visitors remain calm. A level 3 threat has been detected. Remain in designated safe zones." Kale's instincts flared. Something big was happening. They found themselves near the station's central atrium, where a large open space was lined with shops and docking gates. Station guards had set up barricades, weapons trained on a distant corridor. A booming voice echoed, "Surrender now, or we will open fire!" Kale craned his neck, catching a glimpse of an ominous figure striding toward the barricade. He recognized the armor style, top-of-the-line mercenary tech, probably from the same group that attacked the outpost. A quick glance at Zaira showed that she recognized it too. They must have tracked us somehow, she muttered, eyes narrowing. He checked his weapon, cursing that he only had a sidearm. She squared her shoulders, that imperious posture returning. The guards tensed, uncertain of her role. Suddenly, a volley of plasma bolts streaked across the atrium. People screamed. The guards ducked. Kale shoved Zaira behind cover, ignoring her protest. "This is not my idea of lying low," she hissed. He risked a glance over the top of the crate. Several mercenaries fanned out, returning fire against station security. Civilians screamed, scattering in every direction. The mercenaries appeared heavily armed, wearing advanced suits that shimmered with personal shielding. A station official shouted over the intercom for reinforcements, but it seemed Helios 9 was ill-equipped for a full-scale assault. Kale clenched his jaw, instincts telling him that if these mercenaries recognized Zaira, they might be after her, and by extension, him. She read his expression. "They're here for me, most likely. My empire posted bounties for my safe return, or the black market might have a reward for my capture." He scowled. "So, you're valuable property, are you?" She shot him a fierce look. "I'm not property. But yes, there's a price on my head, alive or mostly alive." A plasma bolt ripped through the air above them. Kale cursed, returning fire. His shots pinged off a merc's shield. Zaira held out her hand, sending a pulse of her energy across the atrium. One mercenary was slammed backward, shield flickering wildly. Kale took the opening and shot him in the visor, dropping him. Station guards noticed their efforts. One guard shouted, "Hey! You two, help us push them back." Kale and Zaira exchanged a quick, tense glance. She nodded, surprisingly cooperative. They advanced behind crates, providing covering fire. Zaira unleashed another wave of kinetic force, staggering two more mercenaries. Kale's bullets found their marks. The conflict was brutal and fast-paced. The guards, emboldened by Zaira's display of power, surged forward. The mercenaries tried to regroup, but the station's defense turrets activated overhead, spraying the area with charged pulses. One mercenary managed to toss a grenade. Kale tackled Zaira to the ground, shielding her just before it exploded, the shockwave rocking the station. Dust rained from the ceiling. She pushed him off, eyes flashing with anger. "I didn't need saving," he snorted, ignoring the raw sting in his shoulder. "You're welcome." They got up, pressing the attack again. In a sudden display of coordination, the remaining mercenaries fired in unison at the guard line, punching through and leaving 3 officers wounded. Kale and Zaira found themselves momentarily isolated behind a chunk of fallen signage. "Enough," she snarled, stepping out with both palms raised. This time, the wave of her power was larger, a ripping force that tore up the floor panels and slammed into the mercenaries with bone-shattering impact. Kale marveled at her might, but noticed the strain on her face as she nearly collapsed from the exertion. He capitalized on the opening, finishing off the last disoriented mercenaries. The atrium fell silent except for the crackling fires and the groans of the wounded. Station guards stormed forward to secure the area. Kale turned to Zaira, seeing how she wavered slightly on her feet. He caught her elbow, steadying her. She shrugged him off, but not as angrily as before, her breath ragged. A high-ranking station officer approached, weapon drawn, expression grim. "You two. Come with me. The commander wants a word." Kale's spine stiffened. That tone suggested they were either going to be rewarded or arrested, or both. He glanced at Zaira. She returned his look, her eyes flicking with caution. They followed the officer through the battered atrium to a secure control center. Inside, the station's commander, a tall, severe-faced woman, stood over a flickering hollow map of Helios 9. She eyed Kale and Zaira as they entered. "I was told you helped repel the mercenary assault." Kale nodded. "I'm Kale, an independent operative." We picked up wounded survivors, brought them here. Her gaze shifted to Zyra. And you are? Zyra lifted her chin. Does it matter? I helped you as well. The commander's lips tightened. I prefer to know who I'm dealing with. Cale cleared his throat. She's part of an alien faction. High-value target to some unsavory groups. Zyra shot him a sharp glance but didn't correct him. The commander took a slow breath. Helios 9 is neutral territory. We don't typically allow individuals who bring bounty hunters to our doorstep to remain. However, you saved our station from significant damage. Zyra looked unimpressed. Then let us leave. We won't trouble you further. The commander's gaze narrowed. I'm aware of the rumors that an Imperial Queen is missing, with a bounty that could fund a small fleet. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Zyra's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Cale sensed the confrontation was moments from turning ugly. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Look, we'll depart as soon as our ship is repaired. We didn't intend to bring trouble. If you need compensation, maybe we can arrange something. The commander studied them for a long moment. Finally, she sighed. Fine. But I won't risk station security further. You're both confined to the docking level until your ship is ready. Any violation of station rules, and you'll be ejected into space. They agreed, albeit with tension thick in the air. Security personnel escorted them back to the docking bays. Along the way, Cale and Zyra exchanged no words, only the occasional glance charged with unresolved friction. Once at their vessel, they discovered the mechanics already working to patch up the hull and systems. The lead mechanic tipped his head in greeting. We'll have this operational by tomorrow, if you can pay. Cale frowned. He had some credits, but not enough for extensive repairs. Zyra, reading the situation, spoke up. I can provide certain, valuable items. As collateral. The mechanic's eyes lit up. We can discuss terms. They reached a quick arrangement involving some rare materials Zyra claimed she had in hidden compartments on the ship. Cale didn't question it. He was too exhausted to fight about finances. The mechanic and his crew continued their work, leaving Cale and Zyra alone near the ramp. Tomorrow, Cale muttered. Then we'll be out of here. She said nothing, arms folded, gazing across the bay. The battered remains of other ships lined the far walls, each telling a story of conflict or misfortune. Her expression was distant, as though she was finally allowing herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. He stepped closer, but not too close. We'll get a secure line in the morning. I'll contact the human command. We'll see about negotiating your surrender. She whipped her head around, fury sparking in her eyes. Surrender? You think I'll just bow to your people? He squared his shoulders. What do you expect me to do? Hide you forever? We both know you can't keep running indefinitely. She took a threatening step forward, and he forced himself not to. Retreat. Her voice lowered to a dangerous level. I'd rather die than be paraded around as a war trophy for your confederation. He held her glare. What about your empire? Your people? Do you want them to assume you're gone for good? A muscle in her jaw twitched. She looked away, frustrated. You wouldn't understand the balancing act of power that keeps my empire stable. Try me, he said quietly. I've seen enough death to want stability too. She hesitated, tension rippling through her posture. Then she scoffed, turning away as if to walk off. But she paused, glancing over her shoulder. Whatever you plan to do, it will fail unless you realize something fundamental. My empire respects strength, not negotiations. Turn me over meekly, and they'll retaliate. Hard. Cale's grip on his sidearm tightened, though he made no move to draw it. So you're saying we can't take you prisoner without consequences? She gave a bitter laugh. Of course not. They'll see it as weakness, an insult. A captured queen is a reason for total war. His chest clenched at the thought. Then what the hell are we supposed to do? She opened her mouth to answer but seemed to think better of it. Let's just say there might be a path that doesn't lead to mutual annihilation. But it won't be easy. Or safe. He studied her, searching for the lie in her eyes. But she looked almost weary, though her pride wouldn't let her admit it. "Then I'm listening," he said finally. She turned fully to face him, tension thrumming between them. Her presence was overwhelming in the quiet of the docking bay. "It would require an alliance of sorts. You and me, working together to broker a truce. I maintain my authority, but in a way that doesn't lead to more bloodshed." He frowned, uncertain. "Truce? With your empire? After all the destruction? Better than an endless cycle of revenge. You think I enjoy the war? I may not love your people, but I'm not blind to the cost of this conflict." He exhaled, the idea of cooperation with her almost laughable. But he couldn't deny that the alternative was bleak. "We can discuss it after we leave here. But if you double-cross me, I swear." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint swirl of color along her collarbones. "Must you always be so quick to threaten?" He stood his ground, though his pulse thudded. "It's the only language your kind seems to understand." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment he thought she might lash out. Instead, she did something entirely unexpected. She leaned in, just enough that he felt the whisper of her breath across his lips. His heart slammed against his ribs. "You know nothing of what I understand," she murmured. He swallowed hard. The tension between them felt like a live current. He should step away, assert dominance, remind her who held the gun. But he found himself unable to move, pinned by the intensity of her gaze. A flicker of desire flickered in her eyes, but it was laced with challenge. She was testing him, taunting him, seeing if he'd break first. He didn't flinch, but he felt the heat he'd been denying blaze through him. Before either could act on that moment, or end it, a noise behind them startled them both. One of the mechanics emerged from beneath the ship's hull with a clatter of tools. They broke apart, tension crackling in the air. She let out a breath, half laugh, half scoff, and turned away. He ran a hand through his hair, mind spinning. That moment had been more dangerous than any firefight, some raw power thrumming between them that neither wanted to admit. The mechanic approached, oblivious to the undercurrent. "I'll be done in the morning. Get some rest, folks." Cale nodded, glancing at Zyra. She wouldn't meet his eyes, her expression shuddered once more. They found a quiet corner of the docking bay to sit, either trusting the station's accommodations, or perhaps neither wanting to be cornered without the other nearby. He stretched out on a bench, side throbbing from old wounds. She perched on the edge of a crate, arms crossed, gaze distant. The lights dimmed as the station entered its artificial night cycle. He tried to relax, but every time he drifted towards sleep, he sensed her presence, a silent current that refused to let him go. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him. His dreams were a chaotic swirl, battlefields, the memory of her luminous eyes, the rush of adrenaline when they fought together. And most unsettling, an unspoken longing that set his pulse racing. When he woke, the station lights were back to normal day cycle brightness. He blinked, stretching, and saw her standing near the ship, talking quietly with the mechanic. The conversation looked civil enough. She handed him some alien object that glowed faintly, presumably a trade for additional parts. He rose, wiping sleep from his eyes. She noticed him and gave a curt nod. "Everything's ready. We can depart." He collected his gear, trying not to think about how easily she'd negotiated with the mechanic while he slept. If she'd wanted to flee, she could have. But she remained. They boarded the repaired vessel. Once inside, Cale ran pre-flight checks, verifying that the hull was sound and the engines were at full capacity. Zyra leaned against the cockpit wall, observing with cool detachment. When he was done, she slipped into the co-pilot's seat, initiating the undocking procedure. The station's clamps released, and they eased out into open space. Cale half expected the station to turn its guns on them, but nothing happened. They left Helios 9 behind, the stars once more unfurling before them. With a tense exhalation, Cale set a course for a lesser-traveled route. He still wasn't sure where they were going, only that they needed time and space to plan their next move. She said nothing, the silence lingering for minutes on end. Finally, he spoke, unable to bear the heavy quiet. So, about that idea of a truce you mentioned. She turned to him, her gaze intense. Yes. If we have any hope of stopping a cataclysmic expansion of this war, we must show both sides that there's a benefit to cooperation. Your confederation listens to you, or at least you can get an audience. My empire will listen to me, once I reassert my authority. He raised an eyebrow. And how do we accomplish that? She let out a low breath. We show undeniable strength, an alternative to total war. Prove that humans and my kind can stand together without betraying each other. He scoffed lightly. You think a single demonstration of unity will undo centuries of conflict? She gave him a wry look. No. But it might be the spark that changes the tide. We only need enough time to gather supporters on both sides who realize more war will end us all. He drummed his fingers on the console. Even if that's possible, your empire sees me as the enemy, and my people see you as a war criminal. We'll be lucky not to get shot on sight. She smirked, eyes flicking to him with a daring spark. Then we'll just have to be more cunning than our enemies. Are you up for that challenge? Her challenge hung in the air, thick with the old rivalry, the new tension, and a strange undercurrent that pulsed whenever their gazes locked. He felt his lips twist into a half-smile, the first genuine one in a while. Why not? I've come this far. She nodded, as though sealing an unspoken pact. Very well. Let's find somewhere safe to begin this new endeavor. He plotted a course deeper into uncharted space, away from prying eyes. She settled in, watching him with that inscrutable intensity. The engine roared quietly, carrying them forward. Hours passed. They spoke occasionally, brainstorming how to approach the Confederation and her empire, how to gather evidence that an alliance was beneficial. At times, the conversation devolved into heated arguments, accusations of blame, rehashed tragedies from the war. Yet each time, they found themselves circling back to the tenuous desire to make something else possible, something that might save countless lives. Along the way, the tension between them continued to build. Forced proximity on the ship made every brush of shoulders, every shared look, feel charged. Their arguments flared hot, but beneath the anger lay a simmering awareness they both refused to name. Eventually, they found a hidden moon orbiting a lifeless planet. Kale set the ship down on a rocky plateau. It wasn't exactly hospitable, thin atmosphere, temperature extremes, but they had life support suits and equipment. They needed a private place to plan, maybe train, maybe figure out how to present themselves to the galaxy without getting shot on sight. They stepped out of the ship. The sky overhead was a deep black, studded with stars, the planet looming large like a silent sentinel. She surveyed the desolate landscape with a certain regal poise, as if unimpressed by the harsh environment. They spent the next several hours setting up a basic camp near the ship. Kale rigged a portable shield generator to keep out dust storms. She used her abilities to test the ground for any geologic instability. For two individuals who once were captor and prisoner, they worked in surprising harmony. By the time they were done, the planet's sun had slipped below the horizon, plunging everything into darkness. They shared a meal of ration packs, sitting on crates under the flickering light of a portable lamp. When the silence stretched too long, Kale finally said, I never asked, how does your empire choose its queens? She glanced up, startled by the personal question. We're born into it. Bloodlines, genetics, destiny. Many factors. But once chosen, we must prove ourselves through trials, forging alliances with key houses to maintain balance. He tilted his head. And you succeeded. She chuckled without humor. Yes, though at great cost. I had to subjugate rival houses. Some with reason, others simply because they challenged me. He grimaced. So your rule was built on fear. She met his gaze levelly. Partly, yes. But only because that was the tradition. If a queen shows mercy, she's seen as weak. If she shows too much cruelty, she faces rebellion. It's a delicate balance. He tapped a glove against his thigh. And you truly believe you can change that? She stared out at the darkness beyond the shield. I have to try. Otherwise, it's an endless cycle of bloodshed. Your Confederation hates us, and we're taught humans are vermin encroaching on our territory. But neither side will win a prolonged conflict, not without mutual destruction. He nodded slowly. I used to think the only way to end this war was to kill enough of your people that you'd surrender. She gave a wry smile. Charming! He sighed. I've seen too many battles, lost too many friends. Hate becomes second nature. But I don't want more of it. She studied him, eyes softer than before. Your sincerity surprises me. He shrugged. Being stuck with you on a shuttle might have changed my perspective. She laughed quietly, an actual laugh that sounded almost genuine. Likewise, Kale. Their eyes locked, and the quiet hum of the portable lamp seemed deafening. He felt a pull, strong and undeniable, and for once, he didn't try to push it away. The memory of that near kiss in the docking bay flickered in his mind. She tilted her head, as if weighing a decision. Then, in a swift motion, she reached out and grasped his wrist, tugging him closer. He stiffened, expecting a trick, but her grip wasn't violent. It was an invitation. He found himself leaning in, heart pounding. She looked at him through lowered lashes, her breath hitching. For a moment, he hesitated, mind flooded with warnings. She was the enemy, a queen responsible for so much pain. But the memory of how she'd saved those wounded, fought alongside him, and risked her life to escape a doomed station burned brighter. Without further thought, he closed the distance. Their lips met in a collision more akin to a clash of wills than a gentle embrace. She gasped softly against him, her hands curling into the material of his jacket. He sank his fingers into her hair, feeling the silky texture, conscious of the faint glow that raced along her skin at the contact. It was anything but soft or tentative. Their kiss was a battle, teeth and tongues testing boundaries, breath mingling in a heady rush of adrenaline and pent-up longing. She pressed closer, a low sound rumbling in her throat. He found himself pushing back, equal parts desire and challenge. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, faces flushed. She stared at him, her lips parted, eyes glowing faintly with the energy that always seemed to swirl beneath her surface. He exhaled, mind reeling. She drew back slightly, tension returning to her features. This changes nothing, she said, though her voice lacked its usual hardness. He nodded, trying to collect himself. Maybe it changes everything. She glanced away, as if the intensity was too much. We'll figure out how to present our alliance to our factions. That's what matters right now. He inhaled, letting the night's chill calm his heated skin. Yeah. Right. Still, a subtle awareness remained. Her closeness, her taste on his lips, the memory of how her body felt against his. They both knew that no matter what they told themselves, there was no going back to the time when they were simply captor and captive. Night passed in uneasy rest. The next day, they began systematically reaching out via encrypted channels, trying to find sympathetic contacts in both the Confederation and the edges of her empire. Conversations were tense and precarious, with each side demanding proof of sincerity. Kale and Zyra found themselves forging new arguments, combining their voices to persuade old enemies of a new possibility. Occasionally, they clashed. Old grudges flared. He accused her of ignoring past atrocities, she accused him of hypocrisy. But each time, they forced themselves to reconcile, remembering that their unity was their only chance to avert more bloodshed. Their mutual attraction, however, was not so easily contained. Every argument ended with them dangerously close, breath ragged, as if the fight itself became fuel. At first they resisted, stepping away before crossing a line. But as the days wore on, that line blurred. They found themselves stealing fierce kisses in the corridor, gripping each other with bruising intensity. Their nights became a battleground of flesh and desire, overshadowed by the knowledge that the precarious alliance could collapse at any moment. Despite the tension, they made progress. Messages from a few influential individuals trickled back, cautious interest, willingness to listen. A time and place for a secret meeting was set, far from prying eyes. The night before the scheduled rendezvous, Kale and Zyra stood outside the ship, gazing at the planet's horizon. The meeting was risky. If either side decided to betray them, they'd be trapped. Still, it was the best chance they had. She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that felt strangely intimate for the proud queen. He rested his arm around her, ignoring the voice that reminded him how easily she could break him if she chose. "Tomorrow decides everything," he said softly. She nodded, her silver hair brushing against his neck. "If it goes well, we might have a path to peace. If it goes poorly..." He tightened his hold on her. "We fight our way out." She smiled faintly, the glow of her eyes flickering. "Always. I never surrender to fear." They went inside, hearts heavy with anticipation. That night, they surrendered to each other in a clash of fierce bodies and whispered confessions that neither would repeat in daylight. Their passion was raw and unyielding, a reflection of who they were, warriors locked in a love that was as dangerous as any battlefield. When the sun rose, they prepared for the rendezvous. The location was an abandoned mining station in a neutral asteroid belt. Kale guided their ship through the field, weaving past drifting rocks. Zyra readied her powers, though he saw the tightness in her expression. She knew this was a gamble. They touched down gently on the station's landing pad. The interior was cold and dark, life support barely functioning. Kale and Zyra stepped out, side by side, scanning the shadows. A few minutes later, 2 separate ships arrived. One carried a small delegation from the Confederation, stern-faced individuals in formal uniforms. The other brought a pair of Zyra's imperial houses, suspicious and proud. The meeting began awkwardly, each side eyeing the other with centuries of distrust. Zyra and Kale stood in the center, the improbable link connecting them. She spoke first, her voice resonant. She explained the devastation the ongoing war caused, how both sides risked annihilation. She declared her intention to maintain her throne while forging a ceasefire, offering controlled trade routes and communication channels. Kale followed, reinforcing her words with human testimony of the countless lives lost, the cost of continuing conflict, and the potential benefits of collaboration. He confirmed Zyra's sincerity, describing how she'd aided survivors, saved his life, and fought alongside him. Skepticism was high. Accusations flew, spies, traps, hidden agendas. Tensions rose to the brink of violence. But each time, Zyra and Kale interceded, refusing to let either side revert to old hatred. Their combined presence, the raw passion and unity they displayed, had an effect that none could ignore. After hours of heated debate, an agreement was drafted, a preliminary truce, limited trade, and a vow to continue negotiating. It was no sweeping peace treaty, but it was a start. Enough to prevent the outbreak of a new campaign of destruction. As the meeting concluded, one of her imperial delegates stepped forward, bowing slightly to Zyra in a gesture of respect. Another turned to Kale, addressing him with reluctant acknowledgement. The Confederation officers likewise expressed cautious optimism. When the delegations departed, Kale and Zyra were left alone in the station's echoing corridors. They looked at each other, exhaustion and relief warring on their faces. She let out a shaky breath. "It's done. Or it's begun." He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "You're not free of trouble yet. We'll have to keep them in line, make sure no one stabs us in the back." She smirked, lifting her hands to rest them on his chest. "I can handle my empire. Can you handle your confederation?" He slid his arms around her waist, pulling her against him. "We'll handle it together." She leaned up, pressing her forehead to his. For a moment, they simply breathed in unison, hearts pounding. Then she kissed him, no longer with the initial violence, but with a fierceness tempered by something deeper. He returned it, cradling the back of her head, letting the moment wash over him. When they parted, both were smiling. Not an easy grin, rather a promise of battles yet to come, but battles fought side by side. They boarded their ship, sealing the deal by leaving the station behind. As they soared into the stars, Kale felt for the first time that the path ahead, though fraught with danger, was one he was willing to walk. She sat next to him at the controls, every bit the queen she was born to be, but with a vulnerability she only showed him. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, they both understood that no matter what storms awaited, they were bound together now, by war, by fate, and by a love they once thought impossible. When the hyperspace engines engaged, propelling them forward to their uncertain future, either looked back. They'd done what no one believed possible, forged a fragile alliance between two bitter enemies. And in so doing, they'd discovered a passion that changed them both forever. No one could say what the galaxy would bring, but at least, for now, they had each other. And that was enough.